In our last program, we talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the objective was that the human thought, as it has been evolving for more than 4,000 years, since the 22nd century BCE to the 21st century CE, that these two time lines serve as bookends to a collective of narratives, of myths, and of stories that has become a narrative that is bridging the expanse and the divide between the human and the divine. We discussed how many of those symbolisms and metaphors of the Epic of Gilgamesh has found its way through our religious scriptures. They have become the stories of many gods, subsequently perceived differently. They have become the narratives of prophets and the manifestations of the divine on earth in other forms. They have created within us certain notions of historicity and a geographic perception. We realize that for the most part, those myths were in essence a transition. These transitions were, for lack of a better term, geographic as much as they were historical. The places that were named were equally of a geographic reality, not excuse me, not of a transcendent reality. But in all cases, the emphasis was made on a transformation or transference or traveling or traversing. And so, in the symbolic sense, whether the river that was crossed was Indus or Amu, or Tigris and Euphrates, or the Red Sea and the Nile, whether it was the Sea of Marmara or the Oxus, what it meant or what it symbolized was that it was necessary for humanity to not only just span a bridge across to the unknown, but to travel across the uncharted waters. So the rivers, in a sense, divide us, but it at the same time can connect us. So these transformations have happened not just in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but we had many that followed or has followed since. The significance of these, especially in the anthropological period defined as hydraulic societies, have always included a river with its own symbolic significance. The rivers are nurturing, life-giving, but they are also, as a force of nature, sometimes ravishing and destructive when they flood, when they overflow, when they put disorder in the seemingly ordered life that is built around a riverbed. And that's why we have the symbolism there. But there's also the concept of traveling the distance. And in that, for instance, in Central Asia, the land we in the West know as India draws its name from the river Indus. And therefore, for the people of Central Asia to traverse, to cross that river, the territory across it would be simply called a variation of Indus, and thus India, or Hindu, or Hindu, which may be a religious or ethnic identity as much as geographic. But it was also a symbol for an idealized land that can be reached for an eternal prosperity. In other words, India was heaven. The Muslim scholars, through their poetry, often refer to India as such. It wasn't traveling across land, but rather to a land that was idealized in some subconscious way as the heaven on earth. And Western thinkers also copied or built on those notions. Milton's Paradise Lost, whether it was expressed within allegories and metaphors of a poetic language or of a spiritual transformation, India was the paradise lost to Central Asians, to Persians, to Afghans, to all the Iranians and Turanians of West Asia. We also had a similar example among the Greeks who thought of themselves as being in need of a transformation of the spiritual / alchemical type. And therefore, if they had to go from Greece to Cyprus, they perhaps turned their iron into copper. And Cyprus, the word Cyprus comes from copper in the Greek language. And in that, they perceived that they had elevated themselves and improved themselves from transforming themselves from a lower level or a lower rank or a lower valued metal such as iron to becoming copper. But the transformation was not complete, and therefore in order for that copper to be turned to gold, you had to continue the journey southward from Greece, which was then in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. You go to Cyprus, the copper, and beyond to Egypt, which is the gold. And that's the ultimate ideal in the context of a chemical transformation. And the word chemical therefore comes also from the word chem, which was the name for ancient Egypt. So alchemy, as we know it today, is making yourself Egyptian, not a geographic identity, not an ethnic one, but rather transforming yourself spiritually, realizing the potential of your inner essence to become something other than it is, because perhaps it has not self-actualized to reach that higher level. So for the Greeks then, in that sense, going south towards the sun, towards the light, towards Egypt, was that ultimate goal of self-purification. So as much as India was a paradise for the Central Asians, Egypt was the paradise, if we can use the term, for the Greeks. And we have a third parallel, that of the Semitic tribes of Arabia. They also sought light, and that light came from the right. And the right is the east. The word for right is Yamin. And from Yamin we get Yaman. And Yaman was to the right, where the light came from, as opposed to Shimal, which was to the left, the sunset, the land of spiritual impoverishment. So if we had to establish a goal for yourself in the spiritual self-actualization, you had to journey across to the ultimate land, to paradise, to heaven on earth, which would have been in Yemen, where there were trees and gardens, water flowing beneath them. And that was in Adan, which is the capital of Yemen. And Adan, in essence, is the Garden of Eden, and it's in the Eden that we have attained our humanity, at least in the scriptural sense. I'm sharing these examples because, in a way, our geographic localizing of places, of idealizing the unreachable lands that were beyond, were then the source and the bedrock for the narratives which we have built around them. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the same concept existed, with the difference that now the direction was to the north. And yes, you are moving away from the sun into the dark of the north. But it's within that darkness that you find light. And that light will be, again, to blend the metaphors of land and sea and water. You will travel beyond mountains to a sea that will give you the life water, that you will become eternal, and that your temporality will abandon you. And that sea, again, in a parallel structure to that of India, Egypt, and Adan, in this case would be the Caspian Sea, which is also called Bahr Khizr. And in recent times, the spelling has been changed from the Arabic Khidr to a Persian Khizr or Khazar. And allusions are made that the Khazar Empire that was built in its vicinity drew its name also from this sea. In Arabic, Khazar means green, and green is eternal, forever green, in contrast to yellow, autumnal yellow, the dying yellow. The vernal green is eternal, it's life-giving. And in Islamic literature, we have a person who happened to have drank from that water, from the Ab-i-Hayat that we often refer to, the fountain of youth, and the youth here implying that you become permanent. And that person is called Khidr. And Khidr is beyond time personality, a character, a prophet that lives through time. In other words, time has no effect on him. So if you make Khizr or Khidr in Arabic, drink from the water of Khidr or Khadar or Khazar or the Caspian Sea, that who has sought it in the north, we got another idealized state of mind that is woven through our narratives. But why all these troubles? We can, in a way, bring them all together through a realization that through our own life experience as much as through the experience of previous generations, there is a time in our infancy when we have this urge to grow older, to become more powerful and independent, of course. But it is the infancy and childhood that we want to avoid. We want to become adults. And as soon as we reach the adulthood, we want to put on the brakes and stop it there. Then we don't want to grow older. Ageism and all the stigmas attached to it. It's not just a modern day obsession, although this is not universal. But throughout history, such attempts have been made to become eternal, like the gods we worshipped. And remember, Adam and Eve in the garden were between two trees, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. And the tree of life was one that would have given them a permanence of their own. And in a similar fashion through other traditions too. It is these common human instinctive insecurities where we just do not feel comfortable with the passing of time. We want to stop it. We perceive time in a linear way, from past to present to future. And that's the culprit. That's the problem. Once perceived in a linear way, it can't be stopped. And so the ultimate goal, whether it's the human survival as human per se, is to become permanent. And let's not confuse that with the permanence of gods. We do want to become gods in a sense. We want to go back to God. It's a much more polished language, but it speaks of the same reality. So what of the gods of the past? The ones that were idealized and realized out of their natural environmental necessity, not necessarily of their spiritual yearning. And it's in that humans had to create gods, because without them they could not realize a permanence within themselves. So that permanence, that ability to go beyond time, had to be attributed to a god. And so who were our early gods? If you look at the historical records, or if you look at the existing narratives from the epics and myths of our ancient ancestors, we often question and think, not disrespectfully, but rather thinking that how illogical for them to perceive gods in such limited ways. But in the process we forget that gods can be only as powerful as the world over which they rule. And so since the human perception, or rather the limitations of the human perception on the one hand, and the scope and spread of the worldview on the other were both limited, and just for the sake of argument, the world of the ancients may have consisted merely of a few valleys, a land between mountain ranges or mountains and rivers. Yes, they traveled for food as hunters and gatherers, but the ratio of human population versus that of the abundance of nature was such that long-range traveling were not necessary unless dictated by the conditions of the environment. And so, within a limited environment, they had to have had a limited worldview. And within that worldview, however large it must have been, they needed gods only powerful enough and big enough to take care of the problems that they often faced. It was the fury of nature, the flooding of rivers, the floods and fires, and the landslides and the mudslides and the avalanches that were natural phenomena, bigger and more powerful than the average human could take care of. And so therefore, their gods became the gods of nature and of their natural environment, limited in scope from where we see them, but pretty powerful, all-encompassing, and omnipresent and omnipotent for the world in which they operated. And as the human thought in the collective sense perpetually and consistently evolved, and as our worldview expanded, as we went beyond the known horizons to see more and to know more, and realizing that the world was much bigger than our ancestor had perceived, we naturally came to the realization that the gods of the ancients were not powerful enough for the worldview of their environment which we had now perceived. And so therefore, our gods had to be bigger and more powerful, and they were. In the ancient times, the realm between human and God was very close. They were at times interactive. You could perceive that their gods were superhumans, Superman of sorts. And they were interactive, and the humans attached to them all the human attributes. So those gods did become angry, vengeful, full of wrath, and often fought humans. we see many examples, not only in the early traditions, but even in the more recent monotheistic traditions of Judaism, for instance. Instances where humans were wrestling with their gods. It may appear blasphemous to us in the 21st century, but again we have to go back to the worldview in which these were perceived. So it's true that we use the same word, God, or we have used the word God throughout most of this. But it is not right to assume that simply because we called them all gods from ancient times to modern times, that our perception or our understanding of God is the same. It can't be. And therefore, with the worldview we have now in the 21st century, that we are not talking about the limited scope of a few valleys and mountain ranges, and that we are not talking about even the global scope. Remember, until the time of Columbus, at least in their European mindset, the world was flat and limited, and you could fall off its edge. That's only 500 years ago. Where we have reached now is that the transference from Earth-centric to heliocentric and beyond, to the cosmos, to the clusters and galaxies. We have realized one thing, that our scope, the scope of our worldview, was very narrow. And now we know that it has to be broadened and expanded. But more important than that, what science, and to some extent more progressive thinking about religious thought, share, is that no matter how much we know, there is more to know than we know. And thus, in a more enhanced perception of the divine that we can recognize and understand in the 21st century, then that God, in spite of the use of the same name, would have to be far more inclusive and far more omnipotent and omnipresent than anything we had understood and perceived before. And many times we encounter this problem, that when we define God in the ways of the ancients, and we look at what we understand through science and technology in our modern times, the mismatch, the disconnect, the incompatibility between how God was perceived and what the reality dictates is such that many abandon religion altogether. Because in the denial, we don't have to worry about resolving the complexities of the thought. And in the context of our modern mindset of instant gratification, we don't need to, we don't bother to, and we don't want to know what God is, or if there is a God. It's passé. God is irrelevant. We humans have conquered nature. Everything that there is the power of the human mind, our rational sense, our thought can conquer anything and everything. And so therefore, if God was created in the human imagination to resolve problems that individuals could not handle by themselves, then gods came in handy, useful, utilitarian. But if gods were meant to be entities that defined the opposite side of an equation in which we humans, with all the knowledge we have and with all the capacities we have developed, the necessity of a comforting sense of belonging within a certainty will never be answered unless we acknowledge that we are only half of the equation. And it's there where we have to have the wisdom to go beyond ourselves, whether in a dimensional sense we go within or we go without, to the outside. There are worlds out there that the mere labeling of metaphysical does not suffice. It's not enough to define it merely as the metaphysical. The physical is not the criteria. The human perception, with all its limitations, are not the criteria. It's the very essence of the totality of being, whose realization makes us aware that regardless of how human-centric, ego-centric, self-centered that we are, there are selves outside of the self that we claim ours. And I hope this doesn't come across as a preaching, or not even as a teaching, but rather a heart-to-heart, as human to human, so that we can have an understanding that the whole purpose of our existence is not merely in the body. If that were the case, we cannot draw a line between ourselves and the animal kingdom. We are part of that animal kingdom, and that's not anything to be ashamed of. But if we want to understand it in the sense that the evolution, the evolving growth of our brain cells, to speak materialistically, had to have learned that the goal is not a mere survival in the physical, but beyond. Where? We don't know. But do we stop here? Never. Let's take a break.